There was a boy named Elias, who lived in a small village at the edge of a dark forest, and he had never once left that village in all his 17 years of life, not because he was afraid, but because nobody ever told him there was a reason to leave. And so he stayed and worked in his father's bakery every single morning before the sun came up, kneading dough and stacking loaves of bread on wooden shelves while the rest of the village slept in their warm beds. Elias was not like the other boys in the village, and he knew this because they reminded him of it every single day. They were strong and loud and loved to wrestle in the mud behind the old church. But Elias was thin and quiet, and preferred to sit by the river and watch the water move over the stones. And sometimes he would find strange markings on the rocks near the water, symbols that looked like they had been carved there by someone a very long time ago. And he would trace them with his fingers and wonder what they meant. His mother had died when he was very young, and his father never talked about her, not even when Elias asked, which he did many times when he was small. His father would simply shake his head and walk away and close the door to his bedroom, and Elias learned after a while to stop asking, because the silence that followed his questions was worse than not knowing the answers. One evening in late autumn, when the leaves had turned orange and red, and the air smelled like cold rain, Elias was walking home from the river, when he noticed something strange near the old stone bridge that crossed over the narrowest part of the water. There was a woman standing there, tall and thin with silver hair that fell all the way to her waist, and she was wearing a long coat that looked like it was made from the night sky itself, dark and shimmering with tiny points of light. Elias stopped and stared, because he had never seen this woman before, and in a village as small as his, everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was a very rare thing. The woman turned her head and looked directly at him, and her eyes were the strangest color he had ever seen, a pale gold that seemed to glow in the fading light of the evening, and she smiled at him, not a warm smile, but a knowing one, the kind of smile that said she had been waiting for him. "You are the baker's son," she said, and it was not a question, but a statement, spoken in a voice that was low and calm, and carried across the evening air like music. Elias nodded, because he did not know what else to do, and the woman walked toward him slowly, her long coat trailing behind her on the wet ground, and when she was close enough for him to see the lines on her face, he realized she was much older than he had first thought, maybe as old as the village itself. "Your mother left something for you," the woman said, and those words hit Elias like a wave of cold water, because nobody ever talked about his mother. Not his father, not the villagers, not anyone. Was this stranger speaking about her, as if she had known her? "What do you mean?" Elias asked, and his voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. The woman reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in dark cloth, and she held it out to him. Elias hesitated for a moment, looking at her golden eyes, and then at the wrapped object, and then he took it because something deep inside him told him he was supposed to, the same way he knew how to breathe without ever being taught. He unwrapped the cloth carefully and found a key inside, but it was not like any key he had ever seen. It was made of a dark metal that felt warm to the touch, and it had symbols carved into it, the same kind of symbols he had seen on the rocks by the river. And at the top of the key there was a small red stone that seemed to pulse with a faint light, like a tiny heartbeat. "What does it open?" Elias asked, but when he looked up, the woman was gone, vanished, as if she had never been there at all, and he was alone on the road, with the key in his hand, and the sound of the river behind him, and the cold wind pulling at his clothes. He ran home and found his father sitting by the fire in the kitchen, staring at the flames the way he always did in the evenings, with a look on his face that was somewhere between sadness and something else that Elias could never quite name. Elias held out the key and told his father everything about the woman and what she had said about his mother. And he watched his father's face change from tired to shocked to something that looked very much like fear. His father stood up so fast that his chair fell over behind him, and he grabbed Elias by the shoulders and looked him straight in the eyes with an intensity that Elias had never seen before. "Where did you meet this woman?" his father demanded, and his hands were shaking. "By the old bridge," Elias said. "She said my mother left this for me." His father let go of him and turned away, running both hands through his hair, and for a long time he said nothing, and the only sound in the kitchen was the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside the windows. "I hoped this day would never come," his father finally said, and his voice sounded broken, like something inside him had cracked open after being held together for a very long time. "Time? What day?" Elias asked. "What is this key? What are you not telling me?" His father sat down again, slowly this time, and he looked at Elias with eyes that were full of tears, and he said, "Your mother was not from this village, Elias. She was not from any village or town or city that you will find on any map. And that key you are holding is the only thing that connects this world to the place she came from." Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not really, but in the way that the world shifts when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong. And he sat down across from his father and held the key tightly in his hand and said, "Tell me everything." And so his father began to talk, for the first time in 17 years, about the woman he had loved and the world she had come from, and the danger that had followed her here, and the reason she had disappeared when Elias was just a baby. He talked for hours, and with every word, the life that Elias thought he knew crumbled away like old bread, and a new life, strange and frightening and full of things he could not yet understand, began to take shape in its place. His father told him that his mother's name was Seraphina, and that she had come from a place called the Hollow, a world that existed alongside their own, but was hidden from ordinary people by ancient magic that had been in place for thousands of years. The Hollow was a land of incredible beauty and terrible danger, where the trees grew as tall as mountains, and the rivers ran with water that could heal any wound. But it was also a land at war, torn apart by two forces that had been fighting each other since the beginning of time. Seraphina had been a keeper of the keys, one of a small group of people who guarded the passages between the Hollow and the ordinary world, and the key that Elias now held was the last of its kind, the only remaining key that could open the final passage, and there were those in the Hollow who would do anything to get it. "She hid it with the Silver Woman," his father said, "and she made me promise never to tell you about any of this. But she also said that if the key ever found its way to you, it would mean that the time had come and that you would have to make a choice." "What choice?" Elias whispered. "Whether to open the door," his father said, "or to destroy the key and let the Hollow be sealed forever." Elias did not sleep that night. He lay in his small bed under the slanted ceiling of his room and stared at the darkness above him and turned the key over and over in his fingers, feeling the warmth of the metal and the tiny pulse of the red stone against his skin. And his mind was a storm of questions that had no answers, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the golden eyes of the silver-haired woman, and heard his father's voice breaking as he spoke about a world that should not exist. By morning, he had made his decision, not because he was brave or because he wanted adventure, but because the key felt like it belonged to him in a way that nothing else ever had. Not the bakery, not the village, not even his own name. And he knew deep in his bones that if he destroyed it and walked away, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what was on the other side of that door. He went downstairs and found his father already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Look on his father's face told Elias that he had not slept either. "I am going to open it, Elias said, and his father closed his eyes and nodded slowly, as if he had known all along that this was what his son would choose. "Then you need to know where the door is," his father said, and he stood up and went to the back of the kitchen, where there was an old wooden cupboard that had been there for as long as Elias could remember. His father reached behind the cupboard and pulled out a piece of cloth that had been rolled up and hidden in a crack in the wall, and when he unrolled it on the table, Elias saw that it was a map, hand-drawn in dark ink on fabric that was soft and old. The map showed the forest that surrounded the village, but it showed much more than Elias had ever seen on any other map. There were paths marked in red that wound through the trees and led to a place at the very center of the forest, a place that was drawn as a circle of standing stones with a symbol in the middle that matched one of the symbols on the key. The villagers stay away from that place because they feel something wrong there, something that makes their skin crawl and their hearts beat faster. But it is not wrong. It is just the barrier between the worlds, and only someone with a key can pass through it. Elias folded the map carefully and put it in his coat pocket along with the key, and his father packed him a bag with bread and cheese and a flask of water. And then they stood at the front door of the bakery and looked at each other, and neither of them knew what to say because there were no words big enough for what was happening. "Come back to me," his father finally said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I will," Elias said, and he hugged his father tighter than he ever had before. And then he turned and walked away down the road toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the village. The forest was thick and old, the kind of forest where the trees grew so close together that their branches tangled overhead and blocked out most of the light, and the ground was covered with a carpet of fallen leaves that were wet and slippery underfoot. Elias followed the red paths on the map, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches, and the deeper he went into the forest, the quieter everything became, until there were no bird songs and no insect sounds and no wind in the leaves, just a deep and heavy silence that pressed against his ears. After several hours of walking, he began to notice that the trees were changing. They were taller here, and their bark was darker, almost black, and there were markings on them, the same symbols that were on the key and on the rocks by the river, carved deep into the wood as if by a hand that was both patient and powerful. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a soft blue-green color that pulsed in rhythm with the red stone on the key. He was getting close. The standing stones appeared without warning. One moment he was walking through the trees, and the next he stepped into a clearing, and there they were, 7 massive stones arranged in a perfect circle, each one taller than a house, and covered from top to bottom with those same ancient symbols. The air inside the circle felt different, heavier and warmer, and there was a hum that Elias could feel in his chest more than he could hear with his ears, a low vibration that seemed to come from deep underground. In the center of the circle, there was a flat stone slab, and in the middle of that slab there was a keyhole, small and dark and waiting. Elias walked to the center and knelt down and held the key above the hole, and his hand was shaking because this was the moment, the point of no return, and once he turned this key, there would be no going back to the life he had known, the simple life of bread and river stones and quiet evenings by the fire. He pushed the key into the hole and turned it. The sound that followed was not a click or a crack, but a deep, resonant tone, like a bell being struck inside the earth, and the symbols on the standing stones blazed with light, white and brilliant, and the ground beneath him trembled, and the flat stone slab split apart and revealed a stairway leading down into the earth, a stairway made of smooth, dark stone that spiraled into a blue-green glow far below. Elias pulled the key out and stood up and looked down into the passage, and the warm air that rose from it carried a smell that was unlike anything he had ever encountered, a mix of flowers and rain and something else, something electric and alive, and without letting himself think too much about it, he stepped onto the first stair and began to descend. The stairway went down for what felt like a very long time, spiraling deeper and deeper, and the walls around him were smooth and covered with more symbols that glowed with that same blue-green light. And as he went deeper, the air grew warmer, and the hum grew louder, and the smell grew stronger, until it filled his head and made him feel dizzy and awake at the same time. When he finally reached the bottom, he stepped through an archway and found himself standing on a hillside, looking out over a landscape that took his breath away completely. The hollow was more beautiful than anything his father's words could have prepared him for. The sky was a deep purple, streaked with bands of gold and pink, and there were 3 moons hanging low on the horizon, each a different size and color, one silver, one blue, and one that glowed a soft amber. The trees below him were enormous, just as his father had described, taller than any building Elias had ever imagined, with trunks as wide as houses, and leaves that shimmered in colors he had no names for. Not quite green, and not quite silver, but something in between. Rivers of crystal-clear water wound through the valleys between the great trees, and the water caught the light of the 3 moons and sparkled like liquid diamonds. On the banks of the rivers, there were flowers that opened and closed in slow rhythm, as if they were breathing, and their petals gave off a soft glow that added to the magical light that filled this entire world. But there were signs of the war his father had spoken about. Elias could see scars on the landscape, places where the great trees had been burned or cut down, leaving dark, empty patches like wounds on the earth, and in the distance he could see smoke rising from somewhere beyond a range of low hills, and the hum that had been constant since he entered the passage had a different quality here, an edge to it, like a note of pain mixed into a song. He was so overwhelmed by everything he was seeing that he almost did not notice the figure standing 20 steps below him on the hillside, a young woman with dark skin and short hair, and eyes that were the same pale gold as the silver-haired woman's eyes. And she was holding a long staff made of white wood, and she was pointing it directly at him. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice was sharp and cold and full of warning. "I have a key," Elias said, holding it up so she could see it, and the red stone caught the light of the amber moon and flashed like a tiny fire. Woman expression changed instantly, from suspicion to shock to something that looked very much like hope, and she lowered her staff and took a step toward him, and then stopped, as if she was afraid to believe what she was seeing. "That is the last key," she whispered. "We thought it was lost forever." "A woman gave it to me," Elias said, "a woman with silver hair and golden eyes. She said my mother left it for me." The young woman stared at him for a long moment, and then she said, "You are Seraphina's child," and it was not a question. "Yes," Elias said. "Then you have come just in time," the woman said, and she turned and pointed toward the smoke rising in the distance, "because the Shadow Army reached the northern border 3 days ago. And without that key, we cannot seal the breach, and if we cannot seal the breach, the hollow will fall, and when the hollow falls, your world will follow." Elias looked at the smoke, and then at the key in his hand, then at the woman's golden eyes, and he realized that his choice at the Standing Stones had not been the real choice at all. The real choice was still ahead of him, waiting somewhere in the smoke and fire on the horizon. The young woman's name was Kira, and she told Elias everything as they walked down the hillside and into the forest of great trees, talking quickly and quietly, as if she was afraid someone might be listening from the shadows between the massive trunks. She explained that the hollow had been at peace for hundreds of years after the last great war, a war that had nearly destroyed both the hollow and the ordinary world, and that the keepers of the keys, the group that Elias's mother had belonged to, had been the ones who maintained that peace by guarding the passages between the worlds and making sure that nothing dangerous could cross from one side to the other. But 5 years ago, a man named Mordecai had risen to power in the northern territories of the Hollow, a man who believed that the barrier between the worlds should be torn down completely, and that the hollow should expand into the ordinary world and claim it as its own. He had gathered an army of followers who called themselves the Shadow Army, because they wore armor made from shadow metal, a dark material that absorbed light and made them nearly invisible in the dark. And they had been pushing south ever since, destroying everything in their path. Your mother was the strongest of the keepers, Kira said, and there was a weight in her voice that told Elias she had known Seraphina personally. She was the one who locked the final passage and hid the key in your world, because she knew that if Mordecai ever got his hands on it, he would use it to open every passage at once and bring his army through to the other side. But why did she leave? Elias asked. Why did she not stay and fight? Kira stopped walking and turned to look at him, and her golden eyes were full of sadness. She did not leave, Kira said quietly. Mordecai captured her 8 years ago during a raid on the Keeper's stronghold, and nobody has seen her since. But we believe she is still alive, because the magic of the Keepers is tied to their life force, and if she had died, the barriers would have weakened much more than they have. The news that his mother might still be alive hit Elias like a punch to the chest, and he had to stop and lean against one of the great trees and take several deep breaths before he could speak again. For his entire life, he had believed she was simply gone, vanished, probably dead, and now there was a chance, a real chance, that she was out there somewhere, trapped and waiting. Where would he keep her? Elias asked. In his fortress, Kira said, in the northern mountains, a place called the Obsidian Tower. It is built from the same shadow metal as his soldiers' armor, and it is said to be impossible to enter without an army. But we do not have an army, Elias. Not anymore. The Shadow Army has been too strong, and our forces have been scattered across the hollow, fighting smaller battles just to survive. They continued walking through the forest, and Kira led him to a hidden camp tucked into a hollow between the roots of the largest tree Elias had ever seen. The roots rose out of the ground like walls, creating natural rooms and corridors, and inside this living structure there were about 30 people, men and women and a few children, all of them looking tired and thin and scared. But when they saw Kira return with Elias, and when they saw the key in his hand, something changed in their faces, a spark of something that had been missing. This is the son of Seraphina, Kira announced, and a murmur went through the group like a wave, and they looked at Elias with wide eyes and whispered to each other, and an old man with a long white beard stepped forward and bowed his head. We have been waiting for you, the old man said. The prophecy said that when the last key returned to the hollow, the child of the greatest keeper would carry it, and that child would have the power to either save us or doom us all. I do not know anything about prophecies, Elias said honestly. I am just a baker's son from a small village. Until yesterday, I did not even know this place existed. The old man smiled, and it was a kind smile, the kind that comes from someone who has seen many things and is not surprised by anything anymore. That is exactly what the prophecy said you would say, the old man replied, and despite everything, Elias almost laughed. They gave him food and water and a place to rest, and while he ate, Kira sat beside him and explained the plan, or what little plan they had. The key that Elias carried was not just a tool for opening and closing passages between the worlds. It was also a weapon, the only weapon that could destroy the shadow metal that gave Mordecai's army its power. And if they could get the key to the Obsidian Tower and use it at the source of the shadow metal, they could break Mordecai's power forever. But the tower is heavily guarded, Kira said, and the journey north is dangerous, through territory that Mordecai controls. And we would need to move fast and quiet, a small group, no more than 5 or 6, because a large group would be spotted immediately. I will go, Elias said without hesitation, and he surprised himself because he had never been brave before, not once in his life. But something about the key and the hollow, and the knowledge that his mother might still be alive, had awakened something inside him that he did not know was there. Kira nodded as if she had expected this, and she told him that she would go with him, along with 3 others, a tall, silent man named Rowan, who was the best fighter in the camp, a young woman named Lila, who had the gift of reading the land and could sense danger before it arrived, and the old man, whose name was Aldrich, and who was the last surviving keeper besides Elias's mother. They set out the next morning, before the light of the 3 moons had fully faded from the purple sky, and they moved through the forest quickly, following paths that only Kira and Aldrich knew. Paths that wound between the great trees and along the banks of the crystal rivers, and through tunnels of hanging vines that were so thick they blocked out all light. By midday they had reached the edge of the forest, and before them stretched a wide open plain that was covered with tall grass that moved in the wind like a silver ocean, and beyond the plain, far in the distance, Elias could see the mountains, dark and jagged against the purple sky, and among them, just barely visible, a thin spire of pure black that rose above the peaks like a needle pointing at the heavens. "The obsidian tower," Kira said, and there was fear in her voice, real fear, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how dangerous something is. They crossed the plain carefully, staying low in the tall grass, and Lila walked at the front of the group with her eyes half closed, her hands extended slightly at her sides, feeling the land with her gift, and guiding them away from areas where she sensed danger. Twice she stopped them, and made them lie flat in the grass, while patrols of shadow soldiers passed nearby, their dark armor making them look like moving patches of night against the silver grass. As the day wore on, and they drew closer to the mountains, the land began to change. The grass grew shorter and darker, and the soil became dry and cracked, and there were no more flowers or rivers, just bare earth and stone, and the air smelled of smoke and something metallic and wrong. They made camp that evening in a shallow cave at the base of the first mountain, and they did not light a fire, because they could not risk being seen, and they ate cold food and spoke in whispers. And Elias sat at the mouth of the cave and looked up at the 3 moons, and thought about his father, alone in the bakery, and about his mother somewhere in the dark tower ahead. And he held the key, and felt its warmth and its pulse, and wondered if he was strong enough for what was coming. "You look like her, you know," Aldrich said, sitting down beside him. "Like who?" Elias asked. "Like Seraphina," the old man said. "You have her eyes, the way they look at things, as if they are trying to see past the surface and into the truth underneath." She was like that, always looking deeper, always searching for what was hidden. She was like that. "Do you think she is still alive?" Elias asked. "I do," Aldrich said, "and I think she knows you are coming, because the key knows, and the key is connected to all the keepers. And when you turned it in the lock at the Standing Stones, she would have felt it, wherever she is, like a candle being lit in a dark room." Elias closed his eyes and tried to feel the connection Aldrich was talking about, and for just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, he felt something, a warmth that was not from the key, a presence that was faint and far away, but undeniably real, like a hand reaching out through the darkness. "She is alive," Elias whispered, and he opened his eyes, and they were shining with tears and determination, and he knew in that moment that no matter what stood between him and that tower, he was going to reach it. The mountains were worse than anything Elias had imagined. The paths were narrow and crumbling, cut into the sides of cliffs that dropped away into darkness so deep that when he kicked a loose stone over the edge, he never heard it land. And the wind blew constantly, cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of shadow metal that burned his nose and made his eyes water. They climbed for 2 days, resting only when they absolutely had to, pressed into cracks in the rock face where the wind could not reach them. And on the second night, as they huddled together for warmth on a narrow ledge, high above a valley filled with black smoke. Leela suddenly sat up straight and grabbed Kira's arm. "Something is coming," she whispered, and her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a fear that Elias had not seen in her before. "Something big." They pressed themselves flat against the rock and waited, and then Elias heard it, a sound that started as a low rumble and grew into a roar that shook the mountain itself, and from the valley. Below, rising through the black smoke like a nightmare made real, came a creature that Elias could barely comprehend. It was enormous, as large as one of the great trees in the forest, with a body that seemed to be made of the same shadow metal as Mordecai's soldiers, dark and light-absorbing, and it had wings, vast wings that beat the air with enough force to push the smoke aside and reveal its terrible shape. A dragon-like thing with a head full of teeth and eyes that burned with a cold white fire. "Shadow Beast," Rowan said through clenched teeth, and his hand went to the sword at his side. But Kira shook her head. "You cannot fight that," she hissed. "Nobody can fight that. Stay down, and stay still, and pray it does not see us." The creature flew overhead, so close that Elias could feel the downdraft from its wings pressing him against the rock. And he held his breath and squeezed his eyes shut, and gripped the key so tightly that the symbols on it pressed into his palm and left marks. And for a terrible moment, the beast seemed to slow above them, as if it had sensed something. And then it let out a roar that echoed off every mountain in the range and flew on toward the south, toward the forest and the camp and the people they had left behind. "It is heading for the camp," Lila said, and there were tears on her face. "We cannot go back," Aldrich said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of those words. "The only way to help them is to keep going forward and destroy the source of Mordecai's power. If we turn back now, everything is lost." Kira looked at Elias, and he could see the conflict in her golden eyes. The desire to go back and protect her people, fighting against the knowledge that Aldrich was right. And after a long moment, she nodded and stood up and said, "Then we move faster." They pushed on through the mountains with a new urgency, taking risks they had avoided before, crossing open ridges where they could be seen, climbing steep rock faces without ropes, moving through the darkness between the moons when the shadows were deepest and most dangerous. Rowan took the lead now, his sword drawn and ready, and twice they encountered small patrols of shadow soldiers on the mountain paths. The first time, Rowan dealt with them silently and quickly, moving with a speed that Elias could barely follow, his blade cutting through the shadow metal armor as if it was made of paper. And Elias learned in that moment that Rowan was not just a good fighter, but something else entirely, something more than human. And when he looked at Kira with a question in his eyes, she simply said, "He is half hollow, born between the worlds, and the shadow metal cannot protect against his blade, because his blade was forged in both worlds at once." The second patrol was larger, 8 soldiers instead of 3, and Rowan could not handle them alone. Kira fought beside him with her staff, which turned out to be far more than just a walking stick, because when she swung it, it left trails of golden light in the air, and where that light touched the shadow soldiers, they stumbled and fell as if they had been struck by lightning, and Leela used her gift to misdirect the soldiers, making them see threats that were not there, and ignore the real dangers until it was too late. Elias watched from behind a rock, clutching the key and feeling useless, and when the fight was over and the shadow soldiers lay scattered on the ground, he came out and looked at his companions with shame in his eyes. "I cannot fight," he said. "I do not know how to use a sword, or a staff, or a gift. I am just a baker." Rowan cleaned his blade and looked at Elias with calm dark eyes and said, "You carry the key. That is your weapon, and when the time comes, you will know how to use it." On the third day in the mountains, they finally saw it up close. The obsidian tower, rising from a plateau surrounded by jagged peaks, so tall that its top disappeared into the purple clouds above. It was made entirely of shadow metal, just as Kira had described, and it seemed to drink in the light around it, creating a zone of unnatural darkness at its base, and Elias could feel the wrongness of it, even from a distance, a cold, heavy feeling in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The tower was guarded by hundreds of shadow soldiers arranged in rings around its base, and there were more of the shadow beasts, 3 of them, circling in the air above the tower like massive dark birds of prey. And the sight of all that power and darkness made Elias's heart sink, because he could not see how 5 people, no matter how brave or gifted, could get through all of that. "There is a way in," Aldrich said, and he pointed to a spot on the mountain behind the tower. When the keepers built the original structure, long before Mordecai corrupted it, they built a hidden passage into the mountain, a tunnel that leads to the chamber beneath the tower, where the source of the shadow metal is kept. Mordecai does not know about this passage because it was a keeper's secret, and only a keeper can open it. "How do we get there without being seen?" Elias asked. "We do not," Aldrich said with a grim look on his face. "Someone will need to create a distraction, something big enough to draw the soldiers and the beasts away from the mountain entrance, long enough for the rest of us to get inside." There was a silence, as everyone understood what the old man was saying, and then Rowan stepped forward and said, "I will do it." "No," Kira said immediately. "You will not survive." "I am not asking for permission," Rowan said, and there was a quiet finality in his voice that stopped any further argument. "I am the best fighter here, and I am the best choice for a distraction. I can move fast enough to stay alive for a while. And a while is all you need." Kira opened her mouth to argue, but Rowan looked at her with those calm, dark eyes, and she closed it again. And Elias saw something pass between them, a look that said more than words could, a look that spoke of years of friendship and shared battles, and the understanding that some sacrifices are necessary. "I will go with him," Lila said suddenly, and everyone turned to look at her, and she was shaking, but her voice was steady. "My gift can multiply the distraction, make it seem like there are 100 of us instead of 2, and that will give you more time." Elias felt sick, because these people were willing to die for a mission that they had taken on because of him, because of a key that his mother had left him. And he wanted to tell them not to do it, to find another way. But he looked at the tower, and at the army surrounding it, and he knew there was no other way. They spent the rest of the day preparing, and when the 3 moons rose and the purple sky darkened to near black, they moved into position. Rowan and Lila went east, toward a ridge that overlooked the main approach to the tower, and Elias, Kira, and Aldrich went west, creeping through the shadows of the mountains toward the hidden entrance that Aldrich remembered from decades ago. Elias held the key in his hand, and felt its pulse quickening, beating faster the closer they got to the tower, as if the key itself was excited or afraid, or both, and the red stone glowed brighter than he had ever seen it, so bright that he had to cover it with his hand to keep it from giving away their position. They were halfway to the entrance when the distraction began. There was a burst of golden light on the eastern ridge, followed by the sound of Rowan's battle cry echoing across the plateau. And then the entire army of shadow soldiers turned and began to move toward the light. And the 3 shadow beasts wheeled in the air and dove toward the ridge with terrible speed, and the ground shook with the movement of hundreds of armored feet. "Now," Aldrich said, "run." They ran across the open ground toward the mountain, and Elias could hear the sounds of battle behind him, the clash of metal, and the roar of the beasts, and flashes of golden light that told him Leela and Rowan were fighting with everything they had. And he ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his lungs burning and his legs aching. And when they reached the mountain face, Aldrich pressed his hands against the stone and closed his eyes, and whispered words in a language Elias did not understand. And the rock split open to reveal a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. They plunged inside, and the rock closed behind them, and the sounds of battle faded to a distant muffled rumble, and they stood in the dark, breathing hard. And Elias held up the key, and its red glow filled the tunnel with a soft, warm light. "This way," Aldrich said, and he led them deeper into the mountain, toward whatever waited beneath the obsidian tower. The tunnel spiraled downward into the earth, and the air grew colder and heavier with every step. And the glow of the key cast strange shadows on the walls that seemed to move and twist as if they were alive. Aldrich walked in front, with a confidence that came from memory, his old hands touching the tunnel walls as if greeting an old friend. And Kira walked behind Elias, with her staff ready, her golden eyes scanning the darkness behind them for any sign that they had been followed. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the cold, dark tunnel, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that took Elias's breath away. The chamber was as large as the entire village he had grown up in, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. And in the center of the chamber there was a pool of liquid that was blacker than anything Elias had ever seen, blacker than night, blacker than closed eyes, a pure and absolute darkness that seemed to pull at his vision and make the light of the key flicker and dim. "The source," Aldrich whispered, and his voice echoed in the enormous space. "This is where the shadow metal comes from, a well of dark energy that has existed since the Hollow was born. The original keepers contained it and used small amounts of it to forge the barriers between the worlds. But Mordecai found a way to draw from it without limits, and he has been using it to create his army and his beasts and his tower." "How do I destroy it?" Elias asked, and his voice sounded very small in that enormous chamber. "You do not destroy it," Aldrich said. "You cannot destroy something that is part of the world itself. What you can do is seal it, lock it away so that no one can ever draw from it again. And the key is the lock. You must place the key into the pool and speak the words of sealing, and the well will close forever." "What are the words?" Elias asked. Aldrich opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a voice came from the shadows at the far side of the chamber, a voice that was deep and smooth and full of a terrible calm. "The words will not matter," the voice said, "because you will not live long enough to speak them." A figure stepped out of the darkness, and Elias knew immediately that this was Mordecai. He was tall, taller than any person Elias had ever seen, and he was dressed in armor made of shadow metal that fit his body like a second skin. And his face was pale and sharp and handsome in a cold way, like a statue carved from ice. And his eyes were completely black, no white, no color, just two pools of that same absolute darkness that filled the well behind him. "I knew you would come," Mordecai said, walking toward them slowly. "I could feel the key the moment it entered the hollow, like a splinter in my mind, and I let you come because I wanted to see it for myself. The last key, the last piece of a puzzle I have been trying to solve for 20 years. Kira stepped forward with her staff raised, and golden light blazed from its tip. But Mordecai waved his hand casually, and a wall of shadow slammed into her and sent her flying across the chamber. She hit the stone floor hard and did not get up. And Elias screamed her name, but Aldrich grabbed his arm and held him back. "Gimme the key, boy," Mordecai said, and his black eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made every muscle in Elias's body want to run. "Give it to me, and I will let you and your friends live. I will even let you see your mother. Would you not like that, to see the woman who abandoned you?" "She did not abandon me," Elias said, and his voice shook, but he did not step back. "You took her." Mordecai smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Elias had ever seen, because there was no warmth in it, no humanity, just the cold satisfaction of someone who holds all the power and knows it. "She is here," Mordecai said, and he gestured to the shadows behind him, and 2 shadow soldiers emerged, dragging a woman between them, a woman who was thin and pale, and whose long dark hair hung over her face. And when they let her go, she fell to her knees on the stone floor, and slowly raised her head, and Elias saw her face for the first time. She looked like him. Aldrich had been right about that. She had the same eyes, dark and deep and searching. And even though her face was worn and tired from years of captivity, there was a strength in it that captivity had not been able to break. And when she saw Elias, when she saw the key in his hand, her eyes filled with tears, and her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Mother," Elias whispered, and the word felt strange and new in his mouth, because he had never said it to anyone before. "How touching," Mordecai said with contempt. "Now give me the key, or I will kill her while you watch." Elias stood frozen, the key burning in his hand, and he looked at his mother on the ground, and at Kira lying motionless across the chamber, and at old Aldrich, standing beside him with defiance on his face, despite the hopelessness of their situation. And he felt the fear rising in him like a flood, filling his chest and his throat, and threatening to drown him. But then he felt something else, something that came from the key, a warmth that pushed back against the fear, and with the warmth came a voice, not a voice he heard with his ears, but one he felt in his heart, and the voice was his mother's, and it said one word, "Now." Elias did not think. He moved on pure instinct, the same instinct that had told him to take the key from the silver-haired woman, the same instinct that had told him to come to the hollow. He spun away from Mordecai and ran toward the pool of darkness, and the Shadow Lord roared with rage and sent a wave of darkness toward him that hit him in the back like a physical blow and knocked him forward. And Elias stumbled and fell, but he held on to the key, and he kept crawling, dragging himself across the stone floor toward the edge of the black pool. Mordecai raised his hand to strike again, but then Aldrich was there, stepping between them with his arms spread wide, and his old voice raised in a shout of words in the ancient language. And light blazed from his body, white and brilliant, and it held Mordecai back for just a moment, just long enough. Elias reached the edge of the pool and plunged his hand in, key and all, and the cold hit him like nothing he had ever felt. A cold so deep it went beyond his body and into his soul, and for a moment he felt like he was being pulled apart, dissolved, unmade, and the darkness tried to swallow him whole. Fought back. It blazed with light, red and hot and fierce, and the symbols on it burned like fire, and Elias felt power flowing through him, power that came from the key and from his mother and from all the keepers who had come before. And the words came to him without being taught, rising from somewhere deep inside him as if they had always been there, waiting for this moment. He spoke the words of sealing, and his voice filled the chamber like thunder, and the pool of darkness began to shrink, pulling inward on itself, and Mordecai screamed, a terrible inhuman sound of rage and pain, because his power was connected to the well, and as the well closed, his power was being torn away from him. The shadow metal armor on Mordecai's body cracked and shattered, and the darkness in his eyes flickered and faded, and he fell to his knees as the well continued to close, spiraling downward into itself like water going down a drain, and the ground shook, and the chamber walls cracked, and pieces of it, stone, fell from the ceiling. Kira was up now, bruised and bleeding, but alive, and she ran to Elias and pulled him back from the edge of the pool, as the last of the darkness disappeared, and the well sealed shut with a sound like a door closing for the final time. And the key in Elias's hand went cold and dark and still, its purpose fulfilled. Mordecai collapsed on the floor, just a man now, pale and thin and old without his stolen power. And the shadow soldiers that had held Seraphina crumbled to dust as the shadow metal that gave them form lost its source of energy. Seraphina stood up slowly, free for the first time in 8 years, and she walked across the chamber to where Elias sat on the ground with the spent key in his hand. And she knelt before him, and put her hands on his face, and looked at him with those dark, searching eyes that were so much like his own. "My boy," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "My brave, beautiful boy." Imagined meeting his mother 1,000 times in his life, and he had always thought he would have so much to say, questions and complaints and words of love all tangled together. But in that moment, all he could do was lean forward and put his arms around her and hold on as if he would never let go. They emerged from the mountain into a changed world. The obsidian tower was crumbling, its shadow metal structure falling apart without the power of the well to sustain it. And the shadow soldiers across the hollow were turning to dust where they stood, and the shadow beasts were dissolving in the air like smoke in the wind. And the people of the hollow, the survivors who had been hiding and fighting and holding on for years, came out of their hiding places and looked up at the sky and saw that the darkness that had been spreading from the north was retreating, pulling back like a tide going out. Rowan and Leela were alive. They had been overwhelmed by soldiers on the ridge, but the soldiers had turned to dust before they could deliver the killing blow. And when Elias saw them walking toward him across the plateau, battered and bloodied but grinning, he felt a joy so powerful it brought fresh tears to his eyes. They all stood together on the plateau and watched the tower fall, stone by stone, until there was nothing left but a pile of dark rubble. And the purple sky above them was clear and bright, and the 3 moons shone down on a world that was beginning to heal. Aldrich had survived too, though barely, and he leaned on his staff and looked at Elias with pride shining in his old eyes, and said, "The prophecy is fulfilled. The son of the keeper has sealed the well, and the hollow is safe." Elias held the key in his hand, cold and dark now, just a piece of metal with faded symbols, and he looked at his mother standing beside him, and at his friends gathered around him, and at the beautiful strange world spread out below him, with its great trees and crystal rivers and breathing flowers. And he thought about his father in the bakery and the small village at the edge of the forest, and he knew that he stood between 2 worlds, belonging to both. "What happens now?" he asked. Seraphina smiled, and it was a warm smile, the warmest thing Elias had ever felt. And she said, "Now we go home, and then we come back, because both worlds are your home, Elias, and a keeper's work is never finished. There will always be doors to guard and passages to protect, and people in both worlds who need someone to stand between the darkness and the light." Elias looked at the key one last time, and then put it in his pocket, right next to his heart, and he took his mother's hand in one of his, and Kira's hand in the other, and they began the long walk south, through the healing land, toward the passage that would take him home to his father, home to the village, home to the bakery where the bread would need to be made in the morning, because no matter how much the world changes, some things stay the same, and bread still needs to be baked, and sons still need their fathers, and every great adventure, no matter how far it takes you, must eventually lead you back to where you started, changed and stronger, and carrying stories that will last forever.